a land whispered of in broken maps and half-forgotten myths, stretched across the frozen crown of the world. Hyperborea, its name alone lingers like a shadow on the edge of memory, invoked by poets of Greece, by travelers who never set foot upon its soil, and by philosophers who called it a place of eternal light. Some said it lay beyond the north wind, where the sun never set, where rivers ran clear and men knew neither war nor decay. Others believed it was not a place at all, but a memory of something lost before history learned to speak. Yet when the Arctic ice cracks open, when strange stones emerge from the ground in Siberia, or when ancient star maps align with latitudes no human should have measured so early, questions rise again. Did Hyperborea belong only to the imagination, or did it once exist in a form that could change the story of human origin itself? Scholars once dismissed it as allegory, but fragments surface. Greek accounts of lands unreachable, medieval chronicles hinting at people who vanished into the polar mist, and even Russian expeditions that brought back rumors of ruins swallowed by tundra. If those fragments were not fantasy, what else have we overlooked? Could Hyperborea have been more than a myth? An echo of a civilization erased, its knowledge buried in ice? And if so, what would it mean for everything we think we know of human history? Welcome to ARCHAEON. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The image of Hyperborea has always hovered in the margins of human imagination, not as a clear vision, but as a silhouette half-veiled by frost and silence. To the Greeks, it was a place where Apollo traveled during the winter, abandoning Delphi for a land of never-setting suns, where men lived 1,000 years without pain. Later voices whispered that the Hyperboreans were not mortals at all, but guardians of a wisdom humanity had lost. What if the fragments of their story were not the invention of poets, but the memory of an ancient world that existed before the first pages of recorded history? And if such a world had once flourished at the edge of the north, why does its outline appear and vanish across so many cultures, as if it were a truth too dangerous to hold in the light for long? Clues linger in unexpected places. In 1913, Russian geologist Alexander Barchenko traveled to the Kola Peninsula, reporting strange stone labyrinths that locals believed were older than memory itself. Some said these labyrinths aligned with the movements of the sun and moon, as if designed to measure the heavens. Centuries earlier, Greek writers like Herodotus and Pindar described Hyperborea not as a dreamland, but as an actual location north of Scythia, suggesting that their knowledge was not entirely symbolic. Even Diodorus Siculus, in the 1st century BCE, wrote that Hyperborea lay on an island opposite Gaul, and that its people worshipped Apollo in a grand temple shaped like a circle, with rituals performed in harmony with the sun's orbit. Such echoes are unsettling, for they resemble the archaeological realities we see in structures like Stonehenge or the labyrinths of the Russian Arctic. Constructions designed not for shelter, but for cosmic alignment. Skeptics argue that these parallels are no more than coincidence, that myths have always projected paradises into unreachable lands. But how many coincidences can accumulate before they begin to resemble the outline of something real? When ancient maps such as those of Mercator or the mysterious Piri Reis chart lands near the pole centuries before satellite imagery, when sagas of northern peoples speak of shining visitors and warm gardens in the ice, one is left to wonder whether memory is more persistent than science allows. Could Hyperborea have been a civilization that thrived when the poles were not frozen wastelands but fertile regions during epochs of shifting climate now confirmed by geological records? Modern science admits that the Arctic was once warm, its tundra forests teeming with life. Fossilized remains of temperate plants and animals discovered in Siberia confirm that these regions were far from barren in distant ages. If human migration patterns extend further back than conventional timelines suggest, might groups have developed in these polar zones, flourishing for thousands of years before glaciers advanced and swallowed their settlements? If so, their memory would not vanish entirely but dissolve into myth, reappearing in fragments, retold as legends of gods or golden ages. The Hyperboreans could have been such people, remembered not for their mortality but for their mastery of time and stars. Still, one must pause before certainty. The mainstream view holds firmly that no civilization advanced enough to build monumental structures existed in those regions before the known Neolithic cultures. Archaeology is cautious, demanding evidence in stone and bone, not in song and speculation. Yet time and again, discoveries have unsettled the picture. Göbekli Tepe rising in Anatolia 12,000 years ago, with its carved pillars and animal reliefs, defying the assumption that agriculture must precede architecture. The ruins at Gunung Padang in Indonesia, dated by some geologists to far older than orthodox archaeology admits, and the sunken structures near Yonaguni off Japan, whose precise steps and terraces suggest hands that worked with intention long before the written word. If such sites exist where we least expect them, is it truly impossible that a northern Hyperborea once left traces, now buried beneath ice or sea? Conflicting voices arise. Some scholars argue that Hyperborea was never meant as a geographic reality, but as a philosophical construct, a symbol of purity, an unattainable balance between man and cosmos. Others remind us of the fragility of oral tradition, how centuries of repetition distort truth into allegory. And yet others, explorers, mystics, even military expeditions, have pursued these whispers into the polar silence, convinced that ruins, technologies, or sacred relics remain hidden there. In the 20th century, rumors swirled of Nazi expeditions to the Arctic, searching for traces of Hyperborean ancestors. Though often dismissed as propaganda or myth, records do exist of expeditions to Greenland and the Antarctic, fueled by a belief in polar mysteries. Why would regimes, scientists, or explorers invest so heavily in chasing shadows unless some fragment of evidence stirred them to belief? The conflict lies not in the existence of stories, but in the willingness to let them alter the known map of history. Accepting Hyperborea as more than myth would mean admitting that civilization is older, stranger, and less linear than textbooks allow. It would require acknowledging that knowledge rises and falls in cycles, that humanity may not always be climbing upward, but sometimes rediscovering fragments of what was lost. Could the very idea of Hyperborea itself be one such fragment, a memory surviving in Greek hymns, Siberian legends, and Arctic stones, all pointing toward a forgotten cycle of human achievement? And so the question remains suspended. Did Hyperborea exist as land, as metaphor, or as both, where geography and memory blur into one another? If temples once rose at the edge of ice, their stones aligned to the sun, what secrets would lie beneath the glaciers today? And if Hyperborea never existed in space, but only in the dream of humankind, what does it mean that the dream has haunted us for millennia across languages and empires? In the silence of that ambiguity, one wonders whether the North still holds its watch, a frozen mirror to our own forgotten origins. The night closes gently, yet the thought lingers like the pulse of a distant star. Perhaps Hyperborea was not lost at all, but waiting, just beyond the reach of certainty, whispering across time that history is more fragile, more elusive than we dare to admit. And in that whisper lies an invitation. Was it only a myth, or the faint memory of a world erased by ice? There are stories that live not in the open voice of chronicles, but in the murmur of forgotten texts, fragments that slip through the cracks of history and leave behind a question more powerful than an answer. Hyperborea lingers precisely in this way. As a shadow cast across different traditions, a motif reappearing where it should not, like an echo that refuses to fade. If it had been merely Greek invention, why does one find hints of northern paradises in Celtic myth, in Slavic folklore, and even in early accounts from the medieval world? Such continuity raises a troubling possibility that ancient memory carried truths further than orthodox history permits, that entire epochs of human experience lie concealed beneath layers of metaphor, awaiting the patient eye willing to see beyond allegory. Among the oldest references is that of Pindar, the Greek poet of the 5th century BCE, who spoke of a land beyond the reach of hardship, where sacred feasts and music were eternal, and where Apollo himself spent the colder months. This was no idle flourish. In the cosmology of the Greeks, the movements of gods often veiled real geographic awareness. The association with Apollo, god of light, harmony, and order, hints at a society perceived as radiant and aligned with cosmic principles. Later, Herodotus described Scythian tribes and mentioned lands beyond them, inhabited by peoples who lived in balance with the sun's course, though he admitted the knowledge came through second-hand accounts. Strabo and Diodorus added their voices, with Diodorus describing a great temple dedicated to Apollo, circular in form, where priests observed celestial rhythms with precision. If taken literally, such a description parallels the archaeoastronomical function of monuments like Stonehenge or the solstitial alignments at Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert. And yet, Hyperborea's traces are not confined to Greek imagination. Medieval Norse sagas speak of lands to the far north, sometimes described as regions of abundance, sometimes as territories inhabited by giants or shining beings. The Icelandic Eddas preserve echoes of luminous realms beyond the cold winds, where divine visitors mingled with mortals before withdrawing into hidden sanctuaries. Russian folklore, too, contains myths of ancient white stone cities swallowed by ice, and of wandering peoples who carried fragments of wisdom from the north into the heartlands of Eurasia. Could these separate traditions be independently constructed fantasies? Or are they the fractured memory of a shared cultural inheritance, tracing back to a time when the world's climates and coastlines were radically different from today? Geology reminds us that Earth's face has never been still. During the last interglacial periods, the Arctic was not the desolate expanse we know. Fossil pollen discovered in Siberian permafrost reveals that broadleaf trees once grew in what is now tundra, and bones of animals more suited to temperate zones lie entombed beneath the ice. Around 120,000 years ago, much of the far north experienced relatively mild conditions. Could humans have flourished there, developing communities sophisticated enough to track the heavens, only to be erased when the climate shifted? If so, then Hyperborea may not be fantasy at all, but the mythologized memory of those survivors, refracted across cultures over millennia. The possibility becomes sharper when one considers the peculiar maps that emerged during Europe's Age of Discovery. The Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn on gazelle skin, famously depicts parts of South America and Antarctica with startling accuracy, centuries before modern instruments made such charting possible. While debates persist over the interpretation of the southern coastlines, the very existence of such anomalies points to a deeper reservoir of geographic knowledge than expected. Mercator's maps, too, included speculative depictions of polar lands divided by rivers, reminiscent of descriptions of Hyperborea as a land parted by sacred streams. Are these cartographic curiosities merely the product of guesswork, or could they reflect inherited knowledge from older sources now forgotten? Here lies the conflict between conventional scholarship and the speculative fringe. Academics remind us that myth has always placed utopias beyond reach, Elysium, Avalon, Shambhala, so Hyperborea may belong to this same archetypal longing. Yet the recurrence of northern paradises in so many distinct traditions is difficult to dismiss entirely as coincidence. Moreover, modern archaeology has been forced before to revise its assumptions in light of discoveries once deemed impossible. Göbekli Tepe, unearthed in the 1990s, revealed monumental construction in 10,000 BCE, overturning the long-held belief that large-scale architecture required settled agricultural societies. If one unknown civilization could rewrite the timeline so dramatically, is it unreasonable to consider that others, still hidden, may have done so in different corners of the world, including the icy north? Of course, skepticism remains essential. For every fragment of evidence that suggests antiquity, there are embellishments and forgeries that cloud the waters. The Nazi fascination with Hyperborea, for example, tied myth to ideology, distorting its meaning to suit political agendas. Expeditions were indeed launched to remote regions, but whether they uncovered anything of value remains uncertain. Similarly, mystical groups in the 19th century appropriated the name Hyperborea, weaving it into elaborate cosmologies of root races and lost continents, muddying the historical record with occult speculation. Such appropriations make it difficult to separate mythic memory from deliberate invention. Yet beneath the distortions, the ancient sources remain, quietly insistent. What was it that Diodorus described when he spoke of a circular temple on a northern island where the sun's movements were tracked with accuracy? Was he recalling hearsay from travelers who had seen megalithic observatories now lost to the sea? Was Pindar's hymn to Apollo's journey mere metaphor, or an echo of seasonal migrations once practiced by priestly orders linked to polar cycles? And why does the name Hyperborea persist, like a thread through centuries, resisting erasure, surfacing in texts and maps that have no direct connection to one another? One cannot answer these questions definitively, and perhaps that is their power. Myths serve as vessels, carrying fragments of truth across ages that would otherwise consume them. If Hyperborea is such a vessel, what truth does it carry? that human civilization is not a straight line of progress, but a series of rises and falls. That there were once societies whose alignment with the cosmos was so precise it became indistinguishable from religion, or that humanity has always sensed a northern mirror, a land of eternal light, reflecting what is most fragile in our search for origins. As night deepens, the mind lingers on these possibilities, neither wholly rejecting nor embracing them. Perhaps Hyperborea is not a place to be found, but a reminder carved into cultural memory that history is incomplete. The Arctic winds still howl, the ice still conceals its secrets, but in the quiet of myth one can almost hear the music Pindar described, the unbroken hymn to Apollo carried across ages. Was it only poetry, or the faint remembrance of a civilization that once thrived beneath a sun that never set? The question drifts like snow over frozen ground, unresolved, drawing us deeper into the silence it leaves behind. The mystery of Hyperborea does not rest only in mythic verses or allegories sung by poets. It lingers, too, in strange intersections of history, where scattered accounts and material traces point toward something that doesn't quite belong within the accepted sequence of human development. As one moves further into the maze of testimonies, the outline sharpens, not of a utopia of eternal youth, but of a culture whose existence was hinted at, obscured, and perhaps deliberately veiled beneath layers of time. What becomes most unsettling is not what is spoken, but what is left unsaid. Gaps where silence presses like the weight of ice. Consider the labyrinths of the Russian north, ancient stone spirals that have endured on the Kola Peninsula. Some researchers date them to the Bronze Age. Others suspect they are far older, designed with a geometry that reflects celestial rhythms. They stand at the edge of Europe's Arctic coast, where local legends still whisper that they were not built by ordinary men, but by beings who lived before memory. Alexander Barchenko, the early 20th century Russian scientist, believed these labyrinths might connect to the myth of Hyperborea. His expeditions brought back rumors of subterranean passages and inexplicable structures, though official reports remain fragmentary, clouded by secrecy. Could these remnants be the faded bones of a culture the Greeks once idealized? Or are they merely primitive markers later embroidered by myth? The ambiguity is the very soil in which Hyperborea persists, never vanishing, never proving itself, always returning like the echo of a half-heard song. If one shifts westward, another thread emerges in Celtic traditions. The Irish legends of Tir na Nog describe a land of perpetual youth far across the sea, while Welsh myths of Ann-Wyn speak of a radiant otherworld reached only by perilous journeys. These were not northern lands by description, yet their essence, the promise of abundance, eternal light, and beings more than human, mirrors the Hyperborean dream. Could these stories be parallel inventions, or are they fractured memories of encounters with peoples who carried the northern wisdom southward? It is not unreasonable to think of oral traditions as vessels, each reshaping the memory of older epics into forms comprehensible for new generations. If Hyperborea were once a real place, its afterimage might refract differently across cultures, creating variations that resemble mirrors tilted at different angles to the same source of light. Geological and climatic studies provide another unsettling dimension. The shifting of Earth's axis, the cycles of glaciation, the abrupt climate events known as Dansgaard-Oshger cycles. all remind us that regions inhospitable today may once have been fertile ground. Recent discoveries of preserved mammoth remains in Siberia, complete with grass and flowers in their stomachs, show that landscapes now frozen solid once offered lush meadows. If those meadows supported animal life in abundance, why not human communities? And if humans were present, would they not, like all cultures, have left behind symbolic structures, myths, and knowledge systems aligned with the sky? The possibility widens, challenging the narrow corridors through which conventional history allows us to walk. Opposition remains fierce. Mainstream archaeology insists on caution, reminding us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Stone labyrinths could be ritualistic, but not necessarily advanced. Myths could be projections of longing rather than memories of fact. And yet, the counter-argument is itself haunted by the persistence of anomalies. Why do so many cultures imagine paradises in the north? Why do we find maps centuries ahead of their time depicting coastlines supposedly unknown? Why do figures like Barchenko, or later explorers, find themselves caught between silence and suppression when they attempt to record what they see? The conflict lies less in what is known than in what remains unspoken, hidden in archives, forgotten in footnotes, buried in landscapes too harsh for excavation. The web of Hyperborea expands further when one considers Indo-European studies. Linguists have long debated the homeland of Proto-Indo-European speakers, the ancestors of most European and many Asian languages. Some theories place this homeland in the steppes of southern Russia, others in Anatolia. But a persistent, though less orthodox, strand suggests a northern cradle, where migrations radiated southward as climates shifted. If so, the echoes of Hyperborea in Greek and Vedic traditions might reflect not only shared myth, but shared ancestry. The Rig Veda speaks of a dawn goddess who emerges in endless light, of a people who tracked the heavens with devotion. Greek hymns speak of a radiant land beyond the north wind. Could these be linguistic fossils of a northern past, remembered imperfectly as speakers scattered across continents? The speculation is tantalizing, though difficult to prove. Yet its resonance deepens the question. What if language itself carries traces of Hyperborea, hidden in syllables, preserved in myth, waiting to be recognized? And then there are the star maps. Ancient alignments, whether in Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the megalithic sites of Europe, reveal a preoccupation with the skies that transcends geography. The stars were calendars, compasses, and sacred texts. Yet some alignments point toward latitudes where human presence is not expected. The constellation of Ursa Major, the Great Bear circling the pole, has been central to mythologies worldwide. Could it be that its prominence reflects not only its position in the sky, but the memory of cultures who lived much closer to its path, in lands where the circumpolar stars never set? If Hyperborea existed, its people would have lived in perpetual relationship with the pole, a relationship inscribed into their monuments and transmitted, however faintly, into myths across the globe. At this junction, the narrative gathers force, reaching its own kind of climax. Hyperborea emerges not as a single place or time, but as a convergence of anomalies. Labyrinths on the Kola Peninsula, Greek hymns, Celtic otherworlds, Siberian legends, ancient maps, geological shifts, linguistic puzzles, celestial alignments. None alone prove its existence. Together, they form a web of improbabilities that resists dismissal. Could it be that we are staring at the residue of a civilization erased not once, but many times, by ice, by war, by forgetfulness, each cycle leaving only fragments to be rediscovered and puzzled over millennia later? And if so, what does that say about our present moment, our own fragile confidence that history is linear and secure? The lull comes softly, a hush that settles after too many questions crowd the mind. Perhaps Hyperborea was never a city of stone, never a people of flesh, but a mirror held up by time itself, reflecting back our longing for origins too distant to recall. Perhaps it is both, a civilization erased and a myth eternal, indistinguishable because human memory is never clear-cut, always a blend of truth and dream. What is certain is that the name endures, like a quiet vibration at the edge of consciousness. Hyperborea. A word that should not have survived, and yet it has, carried through languages and ages, whispering that the North holds secrets still waiting, beyond the reach of maps, beyond the certainty of history. And so the question remains, was Hyperborea the first dawn of human civilization, or the last remnant of something older still? The silence of the far north is deceptive. Beneath the endless snow and the shifting sheets of ice, there are scars written into the earth itself, marks that tell of upheavals, of floods, of cataclysms that reshaped the land long before written words were carved into clay or parchment. To follow the path of Hyperborea is to listen not only to myths and poetry, but to the ground beneath them, to the frozen memory of geology. If there was once a land of abundance where now there is only frost, then the earth itself must hold the record of its undoing. And in those records, scattered across ice cores, sediments, and submerged valleys, there are clues that whisper of forgotten epochs. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, is one of the most dramatic events in recent geological history. Its onset was abrupt, its cause still debated. Some point to the melting of massive ice sheets and the release of glacial waters into the oceans, others to the possibility of a comet impact that shattered ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. Whatever the trigger, the result was devastating. Species vanished, climates shifted, and human communities that had begun to settle were thrust back into survival. Could it be that Hyperborea, if it existed, was a victim of this cataclysm? If a civilization flourished in the warming interlude before the Younger Dryas, its temples aligned to the eternal sun, then its sudden obliteration would explain why so little remains except whispers in myth and fragments in text. Submerged landscapes add another dimension. Off the coastlines of Europe and Asia lie drowned lands, once fertile plains before the seas rose to consume them. Doggerland, beneath the North Sea, connected Britain to continental Europe, supporting human life until it was swallowed around 6000 BCE. The discovery of tools, bones, and traces of settlement beneath the waters proves that memory of these lands did not vanish with their submergence. Might there be other, less explored expanses, Arctic shelves now locked beneath ice, where human communities once thrived? If Hyperborea was ever real, its ruins may not lie under snow alone, but beneath oceans, hidden where only seismic instruments or chance discovery might reveal them. Here the conflict between orthodox science and speculative archaeology intensifies. Many scholars argue that while human groups indeed occupied now drowned landscapes, There is no evidence of civilizations advanced enough to match the myths of Hyperborea. Yet others counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when glaciers and seas erase so thoroughly. The polished stone tools of Doggerland, the megalithic remnants at Göbekli Tepe, the disputed underwater terraces of Yonaguni, all suggest that human capacity for complex structures may have arisen earlier and in more diverse places than linear history admits. If so, the possibility of a northern center of knowledge is not entirely unreasonable. What complicates the matter further are ancient texts that describe cycles of destruction and rebirth. Hesiod spoke of successive ages of humanity, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each falling from a higher state into degeneration. Plato's dialogues, often cited for Atlantis, also contain subtle references to northern peoples whose knowledge exceeded that of ordinary mortals. Indian cosmology, too, describes yugas, vast cycles of rise and decline in which humanity forgets what it once knew, only to rediscover fragments millennia later. If Hyperborea belongs to this pattern, then its vanishing is not anomalous but archetypal. Civilizations rise, flourish, collapse, and survive only as memory carried forward by myth. The web stretches wider when we consider the migration of symbols. Swastikas carved into stones in Siberia, spirals etched into labyrinths of the Arctic coast, sunwheels in Celtic lands, all bear uncanny resemblances, as though humanity carried north-born symbols across continents. Archaeologists explain these as convergent evolution of motifs, yet their persistence in sacred contexts suggests something more. Could it be that the Hyperborean legacy was not stone cities or preserved ruins, but a symbolic language transmitted through generations? If so, its temple of Apollo, circular and radiant, may have been less a place than a pattern, a cosmogram repeated across the world in different forms, from Stonehenge to Navajo sand paintings. And yet here, too, the shadow of skepticism falls. For every pattern one can trace, another voice argues coincidence. Human beings everywhere worshipped the sun, everywhere observed the stars, everywhere carved spirals and circles because they are universal forms. Why must we project a lost Hyperborea into what could be explained by universal psychology? The challenge is real, but it does not erase the peculiar fact that northern lands, long thought uninhabitable, were remembered again and again as paradises of light. If the explanation is universal longing, why place paradise so consistently in the north, at the very threshold of ice and darkness? The climax emerges in the uneasy space between science and legend. Ice core samples confirm rapid climate shifts, landscapes drowned and reborn. Ancient texts describe ages of decline, civilizations undone by catastrophe. Myths across continents evoke radiant lands beyond the north wind. Maps of the Renaissance depict polar islands that should not have been known. Together they weave a pattern too complex to ignore, yet too elusive to prove. It is as though Hyperborea exists in a liminal space, half fact, half metaphor, its reality determined not by what can be excavated, but by the resonance it leaves across time. As the rhythm slows, one is left with the quiet sense that perhaps Hyperborea was never meant to be found in soil or stone. Perhaps it is a reminder carved into the human psyche that no civilization, however radiant, can escape the cycles of nature, that beneath ice and ocean lie the remnants not only of forgotten worlds, but of forgotten possibilities. The name lingers like frost on the breath, delicate and ungraspable. Hyperborea. Was it the dawn before the fall? Or the echo of a dream humanity still carries? A dream that waits for us in the silence of the north. It begins with a question too heavy for the surface of history to carry. How much knowledge has been erased? How many memories deliberately concealed? How many stories reduced to allegory so that their deeper implications would never trouble the order of things? Hyperborea lingers in this shadow, as if it were not only lost to time, but carefully hidden, guarded by the weight of doubt. For when a story survives across millennia, across languages, across landscapes too distant to share a common thread, does it not suggest that something more than imagination is at work? Greek accounts may be the best known, yet there are others that disturb the waters. In the Orphic fragments, faint but evocative, there are hymns to the pole, to regions of eternal light where the cycle of death and rebirth is broken. In later writings of Roman antiquity, the north is not merely cold and barren, but a threshold to mysteries, a place where mortals might draw nearer to divinity. Even the philosopher Proclus, writing in the 5th century CE, referred to the Hyperboreans not as invention, but as a people of unique knowledge, custodians of sacred rites. Was this a metaphor, or the echo of something once observed and then slowly erased from the official narrative of the world? In Russia, echoes of the same motif appear, though clothed in different garments. Legends from the White Sea coast tell of stone cities swallowed by ice, of ancestors who vanished into caverns beneath the tundra when the great cold came. These stories may appear folkloric, but they resemble accounts from Siberia of tribes who claimed descent from shining ones who came from the north, bringing with them knowledge of fire and order before disappearing into the polar horizon. Anthropologists recording such tales often noted their strange similarity to myths half a world away. Why should such distant peoples place their origins in lands beyond the reach of ordinary settlement? The evidence that haunts most insistently, however, comes not from myth, but from the unyielding record of stone. The labyrinths of the Solovetsky Islands, built of piled boulders in spirals and double rings, have puzzled scholars for centuries. Some propose they were fishing traps, others ritual pathways, but their alignments suggest a deeper rhythm. Entrances facing solstitial sunrises, central chambers resonant with echoes. They are not fortifications, not homes, but spaces where sky and earth were bound together in form. Their resemblance to labyrinths in Scandinavia and the Baltic is unsettling. Was this a shared tradition across maritime cultures, or a survival of something older, an echo of a cosmological template carried from a forgotten northern source? Conflict arises here, for archaeology demands caution. Mainstream voices emphasize that labyrinths can be culturally parallel inventions, their forms inspired by practical needs or symbolic intuition, rather than a vanished Hyperborea. Yet others argue that the distribution of these labyrinths, stretching across the Arctic fringe, suggests a common point of origin. The possibility unsettles tidy narratives of cultural diffusion. For if the Hyperborean memory left not only myths but monuments, then its reality would demand more than poetic interpretation. It would mean that at least some fragments of that lost society's architecture still remain, silent but enduring, awaiting recognition beneath the harsh northern sky. The web stretches even further when one follows the migration of myth into medieval Europe. Chroniclers of the Middle Ages, though often blending fact and fable, sometimes spoke of northern lands inhabited by peoples blessed with extraordinary longevity. In the 12th century Historia Norvegii, references appear to regions at the edges of the known world where day and night merged, echoing the polar conditions described in much older texts. These were not idealized utopias, but ambiguous lands, filled with both light and danger, where the line between human and divine blurred. Even travelers like Gerald of Wales, writing of islands beyond Britain, hinted at otherworldly realms lying in the cold seas. Could it be that fragments of Hyperborea persisted into the medieval imagination, faintly remembered by seafarers and monks who glimpsed lands far to the north? Climax arrives in the recognition that Hyperborea is not a single thread, but a tapestry woven from many strands: Greek hymns, Roman philosophy, Siberian legends, Russian labyrinths, medieval chronicles. Alone, each is fragile. Together they resist dismissal. The danger lies not in believing too much, but in ignoring the pattern that arises when one looks across time and space. For what if Hyperborea was not a single landmass, but a cultural memory spread across generations, rooted in a time when the Arctic was not sealed by ice? What if its knowledge, fragmented but enduring, seeded itself across continents as survivors carried stories southward, stories that transformed into myths of shining lands, of gods who withdrew, of paradises lost? And yet, skepticism presses hard. Was it not always the habit of humanity to imagine golden ages, to project perfection into unreachable realms? Perhaps Hyperborea is only this: a dream that recurs because it reflects a psychological need, not an archaeological truth. Perhaps the labyrinths are only fish traps, the myths only allegories, the maps only mistakes. The orthodox view insists upon this, lest history become untethered from evidence. And still, the myths return, like the tide, eroding certainty with their persistence. The lull comes gently, like snow drifting over silent stones. Hyperborea remains uncertain, both more and less than what the myths proclaim. It may be a real memory, or only the dream of a humanity longing for origins in eternal light. Yet the persistence of its name suggests that whatever it was, it mattered, that it shaped the imagination of cultures across centuries. Perhaps Hyperborea's greatest secret is not hidden in the ice at all, but in the human refusal to let it vanish, the insistence that some paradise lies just beyond reach, waiting to be remembered. And in that insistence lies a question that does not fade. What if the dream was never only a dream? The further one follows the trail of Hyperborea, the less it resembles a single myth, and the more it begins to resemble a pattern woven into the very fabric of human imagination. Each culture, each age, each scattered people leaves behind a thread, and when those threads are traced together, they form not a straight line, but a web, delicate, interlaced, and strangely insistent. At its heart lies the same motif: a northern land of radiance, a place beyond hardship, a people closer to the divine. Was it only dream work repeated across civilizations? Or could such repetition suggest something buried in memory, too dangerous or too extraordinary to survive unaltered in official histories? It is not only poets and philosophers who left testimony. Ancient historians, often dismissed for their reliance on hearsay, provide clues that still trouble the boundary between myth and fact. Hecataeus of Abdera described Hyperboreans living in blissful isolation on an island opposite Celtica, where Apollo was worshipped with music and dance. He claimed their temple was of remarkable size, circular in form, with priests whose wisdom echoed across generations. Strabo, writing centuries later, referred to these accounts without erasing them, as though they were rumors persistent enough to warrant attention. When Diodorus Siculus wrote of Hyperboreans sending sacred offerings wrapped in wheat straw across the lands to Delphi, the image was so specific, so tactile, it felt less like invention and more like memory-turned ritual. How could such precision emerge if there had never been a kernel of truth at its core? Modern archaeologists often explain these accounts as allegories of seasonal cycles, yet the detail of a great circular temple is difficult to ignore. The resonance with real-world monuments, Stonehenge, the Göcek Circle in Germany, or the stone labyrinths of the Arctic, is unmistakable. Even if no direct connection exists, the fact that ancient writers envisioned such structures in the north raises questions. Could they have been echoing reports from travelers, long since forgotten? Could Hyperborea's temple have once stood, a sanctuary aligned with the eternal sun, before sea and ice concealed it? The possibility grows sharper when one examines cartographic traditions. Gerardus Mercator's map of 1569 depicts a polar landmass divided by 4 rivers flowing from a central mountain. He claimed his information came from older sources, now lost. Though geographers dismiss his polar continent as fantasy, its uncanny resemblance to older Hyperborean descriptions unsettles. Mercator's notes even speak of ancient accounts of warm lands beyond the pole. Why invent such detail unless fragments of older geographic knowledge had survived into his time? Skeptics insist that cartographers often filled voids with imaginative guesses, yet the persistence of polar islands across different maps, from the Zeno map of 1558 to fragments in the Peary Race chart, suggests that cartography preserved not only speculation, but inherited memory. And there are stranger currents still. In esoteric traditions of late antiquity and the Renaissance, Hyperborea became associated with a polar axis, a cosmic pillar around which the heavens revolved. Philosophers like Heraclides hinted at the north as the axis mundi, the point of connection between earth and sky. Later, mystics adopted this language, suggesting that the Hyperboreans were guardians of knowledge linked to the pole star itself, knowledge of cycles that extended beyond ordinary human lifespans. Could it be that what survived as myth of a radiant land was, at its core, astronomical teaching, preserved and recast as legend to protect it from loss? Yet here, conflict becomes sharper. For scholars trained in evidence, such claims dissolve into allegory or esotericism. They remind us that myth often cloaks cosmic truth in narrative form, not because it records history, but because it interprets the heavens. To believe in Hyperborea as a real civilization is, for them, to mistake metaphor for geography. And yet, is it not possible that both could be true? That a real people once existed in lands now uninhabitable, and that their memory became bound to cosmology, to star cycles, to the axis of the world? If so, Hyperborea would not be simply a place, nor merely a symbol, but a union of both, history and myth braided into one. The climax of the enigma emerges when we confront the notion of deliberate concealment. In the 20th century, rumors swirled of expeditions, Russian, German, even American, probing the Arctic for ancient remains. Archives hint at reports of unusual structures, though they vanish quickly into secrecy. Was Hyperborea only ever myth? Or was it suppressed to prevent destabilizing the fragile narrative of linear human progress? The idea seems dramatic, yet history is filled with examples of inconvenient evidence being ignored, reclassified, or buried. Could Hyperborea belong to that category? A secret too disruptive, relegated to the realm of myth so that history could remain manageable? And then, the lull, descending like twilight on snowfields that stretch without end. Whether real or imagined, Hyperborea survives because it speaks to something enduring in human consciousness, the belief that beyond the known lies a sanctuary of light, a beginning forgotten, a wisdom lost. Perhaps it was once a land where humans lived in harmony with cycles of nature until catastrophe erased them. Perhaps it was never a land at all, but the inner geography of the soul projected onto the polar horizon. Either way, its persistence demands attention. For why else would the name still whisper across time, long after the land it described has vanished from all maps? The silence deepens. Hyperborea hovers just beyond the reach of certainty, neither wholly myth nor wholly history, its contours blurred by ice and time. Perhaps that is its true power, not to offer answers, but to leave us haunted by the possibility that our origins are older, stranger, and more fragile than we dare to admit. And so the question returns, like the slow circling of the pole star. Was Hyperborea only ever a dream, or the ghost of a civilization erased but not forgotten? In the silence of northern winds, one begins to sense that Hyperborea is not only a mythic geography, but also a mirror of the way civilizations remember and forget. Its traces lie not only in the Greek hymns or the cartographers' guesses, but in the strange convergence of mythologies, rituals, and even scientific anomalies that seem to circle around the pole as if drawn by some hidden gravity. When those fragments are considered together, they form a kind of constellation. Not fixed stars, but scattered lights that, when connected, sketch the outline of a world erased. The deeper one follows those glimmers, the stronger the suspicion becomes. That Hyperborea was never a simple tale of paradise, but a coded memory of upheaval, migration, and knowledge that predated the known arc of history. Some of the most haunting clues come from Indo-European traditions. Scholars have long debated the original homeland of Proto-Indo-European speakers, the linguistic ancestors of cultures stretching from India to Ireland. Mainstream hypotheses point to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, or Anatolia, yet a minority have argued for a northern origin, a circumpolar cradle from which migrations radiated after climate shifts. Though marginalized, this theory resonates with the Hyperborean motif. A homeland in the far north, later abandoned as conditions grew harsher, its memory carried in myth and ritual. In the Rig Veda, hymns speak of dawn that lingers without end, of people who measured the sky with care, of divine companions who departed but left behind sacred rhythms. The Greeks spoke of Apollo's sojourn beyond the north wind, of feasts unbroken by suffering. Could these be parallel echoes of the same ancestral memory? Archaeology itself offers tantalizing, if fragile, hints. Across northern Russia, stone alignments and labyrinths stand in silent witness. Their geometry is deliberate, their endurance undeniable, yet their purpose remains obscure. Were they ritual sites, astronomical observatories, or both? In Finland and the Kola Peninsula, some alignments appear to face solstitial sunrises, suggesting knowledge of celestial cycles far older than local chronologies admit. These structures recall other sites scattered across the world: megaliths in Brittany, henges in Britain, circles in the Sahara, all part of a global pattern of sky watching. Might Hyperborea have been one node in this larger network, its monuments long since swallowed by ice or sea, leaving behind only the peripheral echoes that survived on more temperate ground? The conflict sharpens when skepticism enters. Linguists warn against conflating mythology with migration. Archaeologists remind us that alignments can be coincidental, that human beings everywhere turned to the sun and stars for orientation. Historians dismiss northern utopias as allegories for purity, untouched by corruption. Yet one must ask, why does the motif persist so consistently? Why do cultures as distant as the Vedic and the Greek describe paradises where the sun never sets, a detail that corresponds not to metaphor but to real polar conditions? Why do Russian labyrinths align with solstices, echoing the temple described by Diodorus, said to be circular and devoted to Apollo? Skepticism may explain fragments, but it struggles to dismiss the whole. The web expands further when one considers catastrophic memory. Geological records show that the end of the last ice age was marked by abrupt climate swings, violent floods, and shifting coastlines. The Younger Dryas, that sudden return to glacial cold, may have forced human populations into migrations on a massive scale. Flood myths across the world, Mesopotamian, biblical, Indian, Norse, may all carry echoes of these upheavals. If Hyperborea existed during a brief interglacial window, then its sudden loss would not have been gradual but catastrophic, forcing survivors to scatter southward, carrying with them fragments of memory transmuted into myth. Those fragments might be why so many cultures speak of radiant lands destroyed, of gods departing, of golden ages lost in a storm of ice and flood. The climax of the enigma appears when one looks at the persistence of symbols. The swastika, one of the oldest symbols known, appears in Siberia, India, Europe, and even the Americas. To some scholars, it is a solar emblem, born of humanity's universal observation of the turning sky. But could it also be a survival from a northern tradition, carried outward by dispersing peoples? Spirals, sun wheels, double axes. These motifs repeat across continents, hinting at an archetypal inheritance. If Hyperborea was once a real cultural center, perhaps its true legacy lies not in ruins, but in symbols, coded into art and ritual, surviving long after the land itself was erased. Still, doubt persists, heavy as frost. Perhaps these parallels are only accidents, the universal language of humanity rather than the signature of a vanished civilization. Perhaps Hyperborea never existed outside of poetry, a dream projected onto the blank canvas of the North. But if so, why do we continue to return to it, century after century, as though something buried deep in human memory refuses to let it go? Why did explorers risk their lives chasing it? Why did mystics weave it into visions of cosmic order? Why did ancient poets describe its temples with such specificity? The persistence of the question may itself be evidence that humanity remembers more than it realizes, even if memory comes clothed in myth. And so the night settles again, folding these riddles into the silence of drifting snow. Hyperborea endures, neither proven nor disproven, its name like a star glimpsed through clouds, faint, elusive, but never extinguished, Perhaps it was a homeland lost to floods and ice? Perhaps a metaphor for spiritual purity? Perhaps both at once? Whatever it was, its shadow continues to stretch across the centuries, reminding us that history may not be linear but cyclical, filled with forgotten dawns and silenced ages. In the stillness, the question lingers like breath in cold air. Was Hyperborea only a dream humanity dreamed of itself, or the last echo of a real world now lying silent beneath the northern ice? The echoes of Hyperborea seem to travel not only through the past, but also into the troubled currents of the modern age. It is as if each century, confronted by its own uncertainties, has looked to the north and found in that silence a mirror of its desires and its fears. What began as the song of poets in antiquity became, in later centuries, a symbol seized by mystics, nationalists, and seekers of hidden truths. Yet beneath the distortions, the same outline persists: a northern sanctuary of wisdom, older than memory, hidden yet enduring. The question is not only whether Hyperborea existed, but why it refuses to vanish from the human imagination, returning each time history falters as though it held an answer to the riddle of our origins. During the Renaissance, when Europe sought to rediscover lost knowledge, Hyperborea resurfaced in curious forms. Cartographers like Mercator and Ortelius drew polar continents on their maps, inspired by ancient sources and seafaring reports that suggested lands beyond the ice. Mercator, in his correspondence, even spoke of magnetic mountains at the pole, encircled by great rivers, echoing myths of an axis mundi. To the scholars of that age, Hyperborea was not only allegory, but a possible geography waiting to be confirmed by exploration. The age of discovery pushed ships northward as well as westward, searching for passages, and perhaps, in secret, for traces of the legendary land. Reports of mirages on the horizon, of strange lands glimpsed and then lost in fog, only deepened the mystery. By the 19th century, the myth had been taken in new directions. Esoteric groups such as the Theosophists claimed Hyperborea as one of humanity's ancient root civilizations, predating Atlantis and Lemuria. In their cosmologies, it was the second great epoch of mankind, a land of giants and luminous beings, later destroyed by geological upheaval. While modern historians dismiss these claims as imaginative speculation, they reveal something essential: the persistent desire to link Hyperborea with cycles of rise and fall, with the idea that human history is older and more complex than conventional narratives allow. The myth had become more than geography. It was a symbol of forgotten epochs, a memory of ages erased. The 20th century gave the Hyperborean idea an even darker turn. Certain ideologies sought to appropriate the myth, twisting it into a doctrine of racial origins. Expeditions were sent to the Arctic, sometimes cloaked in scientific aims, sometimes driven by occult beliefs that the North held the key to ancestral power. The Nazi Ahnenerbe, a research division devoted to uncovering supposed Aryan roots, showed interest in the Hyperborean legend, linking it to their distorted vision of prehistoric superiority. While most of their claims collapse under scrutiny, the fact remains that powerful regimes invested resources into chasing a myth across ice and stone. What does it reveal about the hold of Hyperborea? That even in an age of machines and war, the echo of a northern paradise still exerted such influence that men would risk their lives, and the truth itself, to grasp it? Conflict arises here, sharper than ever. On one side, the myth is dismissed as cultural projection, a mirror of human longing for purity and perfection. On the other, it is seen as a suppressed history, distorted precisely because fragments of it are real. For if Hyperborea were only fantasy, why the secrecy, why the appropriation, why the persistence in archives and maps? Why does the name still surface in scholarship, folklore, and esoteric traditions, long after so many other myths have been abandoned to silence? Skeptics argue that Hyperborea endures only because it is adaptable, capable of being reshaped by each age. Believers argue that such adaptability proves its depth, that beneath the shifting interpretations lies a truth that cannot be erased. The web of connections stretches far beyond Europe. In Siberian shamanic traditions, there are stories of a radiant land in the north where the spirits of ancestors dwell, a place of light untouched by winter's cruelty. In Native American myths, too, one sometimes finds memories of migrations from the direction of the Arctic, where once there was warmth and abundance. Even in Tibetan texts, Shambhala is sometimes described as lying in a direction that overlaps symbolically with Hyperborea, a hidden land of wisdom, accessible only to those prepared. Could it be that these scattered visions, though clothed in different names, reflect the same primordial archetype, the memory of a world lost to cataclysm, carried across continents by those who survived? The climax emerges when one dares to imagine Hyperborea not as a single place, but as a code, a cipher through which humanity encodes its memories of forgotten cycles. It may not matter whether its temple of Apollo ever stood, whether Mercator's polar continent was real, or whether labyrinths in the Arctic were observatories. What matters is the pattern. Again and again, cultures insist that knowledge once came from the north, that wisdom departed with catastrophe, that paradise slipped beneath ice. Perhaps this is not coincidence. Perhaps Hyperborea is the name we give to a memory our species cannot entirely lose, even when its physical traces are gone. And still, the lull returns, as it always does, softening the sharpness of speculation into the quiet of contemplation. Perhaps Hyperborea is not to be found on maps or beneath glaciers, but in the very rhythm of human remembrance, the instinct to reach backward into time for origins we half know but cannot recover. Perhaps it is both a land erased and a metaphor eternal, a reminder that what is lost is never wholly gone, only transformed into silence, into story, into the haunting sense that history hides more than it reveals. The snow drifts, the stars circle above the pole, and the question lingers like a distant light. Is Hyperborea only the dream of a paradise that never was, or the fractured memory of a civilization that once walked the edge of the world? There is a strange quality to the myths of the North. They do not only tell of distant lands, but of thresholds, of boundaries between what can be known and what cannot. Hyperborea belongs to this category of stories that hover on the frontier of comprehension. It is never entirely accessible, never fully real, but neither does it vanish. Like the aurora shimmering across polar skies, it flickers between presence and absence, between history and dream. The question that presses now is not only whether Hyperborea was real, but why the idea of it seems to pulse in rhythm with humanity's deeper anxieties about time, catastrophe, and the fragility of knowledge. Mythologies of the far north often speak of cycles of destruction. In Norse cosmology, there is Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when fire and frost will consume the world, and yet a renewal will follow. Some versions hint that the gods themselves once came from northern lands of brightness, before retreating behind walls of ice. The Vedic traditions describe Mahayugas, cycles of vast duration, in which golden ages give way to decline before being born anew. The Greeks, too, imagined a sequence of ages, from the golden to the iron, each step a fall from balance into fragmentation. In each of these visions, Hyperborea appears not as an isolated paradise, but as the remnant of a lost cycle, the memory of a world undone by forces beyond human control. Could it be that what the myths preserve is not only imagination, but memory? Memory of climate shifts, floods, extinctions that pressed so deeply into human consciousness it could not be forgotten, only recast as allegory. The geological record offers unsettling confirmation. The end of the last ice age was marked by abrupt upheavals, meltwater pulses that raised sea levels by tens of meters in short spans of time, volcanic outbursts that darkened skies, and the Younger Dryas cold reversal that devastated ecosystems. Entire landscapes vanished, leaving only islands where once there were plains. Doggerland in the North Sea is only one example. Others lie beneath the Arctic shelves, drowned and buried. Archaeologists admit that whatever human traces existed there are likely gone, swept away by currents and time. And yet, the knowledge that these lands were once habitable lingers like a ghost of possibility. Could Hyperborea have been one such drowned expanse, remembered in myth as a paradise lost to catastrophe? The web widens when one considers fragments from ancient texts. The Orphic hymns describe journeys of the soul to regions of perpetual dawn, where the axis of the world touches the heavens. Herodotus speaks cautiously of lands beyond the Scythians, where stories of extraordinary peoples persisted. Diodorus Siculus offers the vision of a circular temple where priests celebrated the sun's course in perfect harmony. Strabo records accounts without resolving them, as though unwilling to dismiss them entirely. Taken alone, each account is tenuous, but together they form a chorus that refuses to fall silent. Why preserve such details if they were meaningless? Why describe temples, rituals, and offerings carried across continents if there was no memory beneath the poetry? Conflict sharpens in the modern age, where Hyperborea has been pulled between extremes, dismissed by academic caution, distorted by esoteric fantasies, exploited by ideologies seeking mythical ancestry. The danger lies in both directions. To dismiss Hyperborea entirely as allegory risks ignoring the very real possibility that ancient humans remembered cataclysm and survival more vividly than we acknowledge. To embrace it uncritically risks falling into the distortions that have poisoned its image in the past. The truth must lie somewhere in between, in the space where fragments of memory are preserved not as maps, but as myths, not as monuments, but as patterns of thought and symbol. The climax comes in the recognition that Hyperborea may be less a place than a mirror of human consciousness. Its persistence across millennia suggests that it encodes a fundamental truth about the fragility of civilization. That truth is simple, yet devastating. No matter how radiant a society becomes, no matter how aligned with the cosmos, it can be erased in a single stroke of catastrophe. Hyperborea, whether real or imagined, embodies the lesson that paradise is temporary, that wisdom can be lost, that history is not progress but recurrence. It is this recognition that unsettles, the possibility that we are not the first to build, to align, to seek meaning, and that we will not be the last to lose it. And so the night draws down again, soft and inexorable. The snow drifts across lands where perhaps temples once stood, where perhaps no human foot ever trod, and the silence deepens. Hyperborea may never be found, yet it continues to live in language, in symbol, in the haunting suspicion that history is incomplete. Perhaps its true location is neither beneath the Arctic ice nor on old maps, but in the space where memory and myth converge, where humanity remembers what it cannot prove. The name endures like a fragile flame in the cold. Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind. Was it only a dream of eternity, or the broken memory of a civilization erased by time? To approach Hyperborea is to walk the borderlands of certainty, where archaeology fades into myth and history trembles under the weight of forgotten cycles. It is a subject that resists containment, as though every attempt to define it forces it further into the mist. By now the image has shifted countless times, a radiant land beyond the north wind, a drowned plain erased by floods, a cosmic symbol encoded in ritual, a lost cradle of human migration. Each version is incomplete, and yet together they form a mosaic too persistent to ignore. Why does the name endure, across millennia, across cultures, always pointing northward toward silence? Perhaps because Hyperborea does not belong only to the past. It belongs to the rhythm of human memory itself, resurfacing whenever the fragility of our own world becomes too obvious to ignore. The ancients often wrote of Hyperborea in relation to Apollo, god of light and measure. In Greek tradition, he left Delphi each winter and traveled north to dwell among the Hyperboreans, where the sun never set. Some scholars argue this was merely poetic metaphor for the sun's movement in the sky, but others point to it as cultural memory of polar phenomena. For only near the Arctic Circle do days stretch without night, and only there does the sun linger on the horizon for weeks, an eternal twilight. How could poets of southern lands describe this so vividly if they had never heard of such conditions from travelers or exiles? Could their association of Apollo with Hyperborea be a trace of real contact with peoples who once lived under that endless light? The evidence is never decisive, but it is suggestive. Archaeologists working in northern Russia have uncovered remains of ritual sites dating back thousands of years, their alignments pointing toward solstitial sunrises. These are not fortresses or settlements, but places designed for observation, for the binding of human life to cosmic rhythm. They echo the description preserved by Diodorus Siculus of a circular temple where priests sang to Apollo in harmony with the heavens. Are these echoes coincidence, or faint proof that the Greek accounts preserved more than metaphor? Even if no stones remain of Hyperborea's temple, the idea of it reverberates through monuments across continents, as if humanity carried the blueprint of a circle devoted to the sun wherever it wandered. Conflict deepens here, for mainstream historians resist the notion of a vanished Arctic civilization. They insist that such structures reflect nothing more than local ingenuity, that myths of northern paradises reflect psychological longing rather than historical fact. And yet, the insistence itself raises suspicion. For why should Hyperborea be dismissed so swiftly, while other myths, Troy, once thought fiction, eventually proved to be grounded in real geography? Does Hyperborea trouble us because it suggests not just a lost city, but a lost cycle? a reminder that civilizations can vanish without trace, leaving only whispers behind. If so, then its denial is not only about archaeology, but about the fear of recurrence, that our own age, too, might one day dissolve into myth. The web of Hyperborean echoes extends into languages themselves. Linguistic patterns suggest migrations that radiated from Eurasia thousands of years ago, carrying with them not only words, but cosmologies. The image of a radiant north appears in the Rig Veda as hymns to dawn without darkness. It appears in Celtic traditions of islands of perpetual youth, in Russian tales of shining ancestors, in Greek accounts of Apollo's journey. These fragments are not identical, but they rhyme, like refrains of a song remembered imperfectly by scattered choirs. Could Hyperborea have been the original chorus, its voice silenced but its melody carried onward in myth? The climax rises in the recognition that Hyperborea's true secret may lie not in ruins, but in memory itself. For every fragment, maps of polar continents, labyrinths in the tundra, hymns to eternal dawn, one finds the same pattern: a land of light erased by darkness, a civilization lost to ice, a wisdom carried southward and refracted into new forms. It is as though Hyperborea were humanity's recurring dream of origins, a dream rooted in catastrophe. The cycles of climate, the upheavals of geology, the collapses of ancient worlds, all converge in the myth of a paradise undone. And in that myth lies a warning. Civilizations, however radiant, are temporary, fragile as frost beneath the rising sun. And then, as always, the lull returns. The snow drifts endlessly over the Arctic wastes, concealing whatever may lie beneath. The wind carries no answer, only the echo of ancient songs that may have once been hymns to Apollo, or only the sighing of ice shifting under pressure. Hyperborea remains untouchable, both real and unreal, preserved not in monuments but in the persistence of the question itself. Perhaps its greatest legacy is not what it was, but what it forces us to confront. That history is incomplete, that memory is fragile, that the world we know rests upon cycles we barely understand. So the silence deepens, and the question lingers like breath in frozen air. Was Hyperborea only ever a myth of longing, or the shadow of a civilization erased by time, yet unwilling to be forgotten? The path of Hyperborea ends not in certainty, but in silence, the kind of silence that waits at the edge of maps and lingers in the gaps between what can be known and what must be imagined. For 10 parts now, the fragments have gathered. Myths of Apollo's radiant north, labyrinths in the Arctic tundra, cartographers' curious islands, Indo-European migrations, esoteric appropriations, and geological upheavals that shattered entire landscapes. Each fragment resists closure. Each points toward something lost but never fully erased. And here, at the close of this long journey, the question still trembles. Was Hyperborea ever real? Or is it only the dream humanity continues to dream of itself? There is a paradox in the endurance of the name. Many ancient myths have faded, their gods dissolved into allegory, their places confined to metaphor. Yet Hyperborea lingers like a ghost. From Pindar to Herodotus, from Mercator's maps to theosophical treatises, from Russian labyrinths to Siberian folk tales, the word repeats across centuries. Names that survive this long often conceal a truth, even if that truth is unrecognizable. Perhaps Hyperborea was once a land drowned in floods, or a civilization buried under ice. Perhaps it was never land at all, but an idea carried forward, a cipher for what was lost, a symbol of the first dawn of memory. The web of myth has always tied Hyperborea to cycles. The Greeks imagined it as a land untouched by war, a golden age preserved beyond the north wind. The Vedic hymns remembered a dawn without night, a cosmic rhythm before decline. The Norse sagas spoke of radiant realms beyond ice, destined to vanish in Ragnarok. In each case, Hyperborea is not static, but transitional, a reminder that paradises are temporary, that even divine order dissolves. It may be that Hyperborea's true power lies not in being a place at all, but in embodying this principle of impermanence. Civilizations rise and fall, light fades into shadow, knowledge survives only in fragments. Hyperborea is the memory of those fragments, bound together into a myth too luminous to disappear. Conflict persists even now. For scholars, Hyperborea is a category error, the projection of longing onto the unknown. For seekers, it is proof of forgotten wisdom, a real cradle of humanity suppressed or erased. Both views may be incomplete. What if Hyperborea is not either-or, but both and? A civilization once real, undone by catastrophe, preserved only as myth, reshaped into symbol, until no one could tell history from allegory. If so, then its secret is not hidden in ice, but in the very tension between fact and story, between archaeology and imagination. Hyperborea survives precisely because it is ambiguous, because it refuses to belong wholly to one world or the other. The climax of the journey is not a revelation of ruins, but the recognition that the search itself is what matters. To pursue Hyperborea is to confront the fragility of human memory, to admit that history is never a straight line, that knowledge is as easily lost as it is gained. Each culture that remembered Hyperborea did so in fragments. Greek poets praising eternal feasts, Russian shamans recalling shining ancestors, cartographers sketching polar islands. None had the whole, yet together they form a chorus that insists on being heard. Hyperborea may never be proven, but its persistence reveals the pattern of human remembrance. What is too important to forget returns, even if only in whispers. And now the lull descends, soft and unyielding. Perhaps Hyperborea is still out there, under the Arctic ice, waiting for some future thaw to reveal its stones. Or perhaps it was never out there at all, but within us, a dream of balance and radiance humanity has carried through every age. Whether as lost land or eternal metaphor, it endures, like the pole star, constant though the heavens turn. The snow drifts endlessly, covering traces, erasing paths, preserving secrets. In that silence, Hyperborea remains, untouchable, elusive, luminous. Not an answer, but a question that survives every attempt to bury it. Perhaps that is its true gift, not certainty, but the haunting reminder that history is always more than we know, and that even in the coldest wastes, something waits to be remembered. And so the final thought rises, slow as dawn. Was Hyperborea the first paradise of humankind, or the last echo of something older still, erased by time yet still whispering through myth? The question lingers, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, like light circling forever above the northern horizon.